Imagine you are a working musician living in New York in the year 1841. You're on your way to Washington, D.C. for a music gig with two other men who approach you asking if you'd like to join their group. Once the sun sets on your first day of travel, you all go to sleep for the night. But instead of waking up at your resting point, you wake up shackled in a cell underground in New Orleans. It turns out the two men you were traveling with were not traveling musicians, but they were slave traffickers who kidnapped, drugged, and sold you, a free man, to a plantation owner under a false name. Imagine this was your real life, and you were Solomon Northup, a freeborn black musician captured and sold into slavery for 12 years. His story, made famous by his 1853 narrative and 2013 movie, 12 Years a Slave, is one of the many tales of free black citizens who were captured and sold wrongfully into slavery. So you might be thinking, how could this have been legal? Why could people kidnap anyone, freeborn or not? Well, it was all due to the Fugitive Slave Acts. Hi, my name is Sky Weaver, and today I will be teaching you all about these laws occurring in America not even 200 years ago. But before I get into that, I would like to give you all a refresh on what was going on at the time in America that led up to the passing of these laws. It all begins in the late 18th century. While Americans were all rejoicing in their victory and the independence from Britain, new tensions were beginning to form behind the scenes between the northern and southern states. In the north, they were a much more radical kind of states in their thinking, while the southern states were staying a bit more conservative. In the north as well, they had a more industrial economy, getting money mainly from imports and exports, as well as the many businesses that were happening in cities like New York, while the south stayed a more agricultural economy, getting their money from the goods produced on plantations and farms. And then finally, the north wanted to limit and abolish slavery, while the south wanted to maintain and even expand slavery. But the opposition of slavery wasn't the only thing the South was worried about. They also had concerns regarding the escape of currently enslaved people. The slaves knew that if they were able to escape their plantations and make it up to free territory, they would be considered free citizens. So that's what they did. The South didn't like this, obviously, because their workers were escaping and they were hindering the production of goods. So they wanted a new law put in place prohibiting this. They fought greatly for it. So in the U.S. Constitution, the Fugitive Slave Clause was put into place. This compromise was in Article 4, Section 2, and Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution, and it read, "No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due." This clause, found through the Library of Congress, basically states that if slaves escape into free territory, they're still not free, because they still owe service and labor to their owners and must return to give it to them. But as you can probably guess, this clause was a bit ambiguous and didn't really say how they would be delivered back if they were caught. So the South wanted to pass another law that explained the specifics, and it was called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. The law can be broken down into three main points. Section 1 of the Act stated that if escaped slaves should be captured and returned to their masters by appointed authorities or marshals. Once they are captured, they must be taken before a judge and proven that they are indeed a fugitive or runaway slave and not just a regular citizen, in order for the marshal to be granted a return warrant. And finally, anyone who purposefully constructs the return, tries to rescue, or harbors or conceals any fugitive would have to pay a fine of $500, which using an inflation calculator would be $15,000 today. This new law meant business, and as I'm sure you could predict, the North was not happy. Not only were they unhappy about the unjust laws against slavery, but they also didn't want their free territory to become hunting grounds. But this didn't stop the Marshals, especially since in 1794, a year later, the cotton gin was invented, which makes cotton growing even more efficient. But with more cotton comes more labor and an even stronger desire for slavery. The citizens in the North knew that with the new fine and laws in place, they needed to be sneakier about helping escape slaves. So in came the Underground Railroad, a system of supporting escaped slaves from the South to the North using railroad verbiage as a disguise. People who helped the slaves move were called conductors, and the slaves their cargo. This way, slaves and citizens could talk about people and places that were safe to move through in public without drawing suspicion. One of the most famous conductors, Harriet Tubman, helped escaped slaves move through the northern states to the Promised Land, which was Canada. With the new Law and Act, just getting to the northern states wasn't enough. So slaves had to get to Canada, a slaveless country, in order to achieve absolute freedom. We learned about this a lot on our trip to the Haynes House in Alliance earlier this semester. With the Underground Railroad at its peak, and so many slaves successfully escaping, the South grew furious. They needed another law that enforced even stricter laws to ensure that their slaves wouldn't be able to escape. This new law was really just a revision of the older one, since it was called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. I will again break this down into the three main points that it covers. Firstly, who in here considers themselves to be a good citizen? Yeah, that's most of us. Well, this law states that now citizens were expected to aid the Marshals in the capturing of escaped slaves. So if you were a good citizen, as the law said, and a Marshal needed your help, you had to help them. Next, anyone who does not help in the escape of slaves now is to pay a $1,000 fine, which is around $40,000 now, and could spend 6 months in jail. Finally, slave owners could now pay Marshals for finding and returning fugitive slaves, essentially placing bounties on their heads. When this law was passed, chaos erupted all across the country, and tensions between the North and the South grew to this peak. And while we don't know the true cause of it, many people assume that 10 years later, these tensions were the main catalyst to the Civil War. In 1861, when extreme abolitionist President Abraham Lincoln was elected, he said that he wanted to abolish slavery. And due to this, 13 states across the South, which you can see highlighted in red in that picture, who called themselves the Confederate States of America, wanted to break from the North and start their own new country where they could have slavery. And obviously they couldn't do that without ripping apart the country, so war broke out between the North and the South that lasted 4 years. At the conclusion of the war, in the North's victory, President Abraham Lincoln issued a public announcement finally declaring the end of slavery. This declaration was his famous Emancipation Proclamation. In this, he said, regarding slavery, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And shortly after this announcement, the end of slavery was legalized with the Constitution's 13th Amendment, which stated, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And while it was a long and hard battle for the end of slavery, it really did show the strength and courage of the citizens who wanted freedom for all. And because of the Underground Railroad, according to the Britannica Encyclopedia and Virginia Commonwealth University, around 40,000 to 100,000 fugitive slaves escaped to freedom, but around 330 fugitive slaves were returned back to their masters. And although this is a significant difference, it should not discount those who were forced back into slavery, who, like Solomon Northup, were wrongly sold into slavery, and those whose stories were never shared, silenced by the horrors of enslaved life. It is equally important to celebrate the triumph of this time while also respecting and remembering those who had to lose their freedom because of it. Thank you.